Action swapping is the adult form of redirecting children. You're swapping out one action for another. The best example is when we go on a diet and it works for a little bit and then it stops working and then we switch diets. Or we're yelling and we need to practice self-care. We're switching out yelling and saying practice self-care instead. Action swapping nor redirecting work because it doesn't get to the root cause of the problem. You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode 148.
A podcast that breaks it down so you can break the cycle for good. Now your host, Tara Rama, but you can call her T.
I talked about action swapping in the last episode on 3 things about self-care that we have kind of learned and they're not actually accurate. And one of those things that comes up is when it comes to stop yelling, the solution we're given is to take other actions to solve for the action of yelling. So practice more self-care, practice getting sleep, practice asking for help, and then that'll reduce the yelling. And those solutions work. Action swapping works. So the best example is I've been on diets, I've been on point systems, different ways of eating, and then I would lose the weight and then I would gain some back. Or I would exercise for a while and then I would stop, and then it never really solved the issue I was having because it never got to the root cause. And the root cause is when we look at behavioral problems in children, because we call them behavioral problems, or when we look at things as an adult of not achieving our goals, any of those things are not behavioral problems. They are emotional problems. I believe it was Harriet Lerner in her book, and I can't remember which book. I've read several books by her, where she talks about all communication problems are really emotional problems. Meaning whatever behavior you want to execute, you want to say something the way you want to say it, is really about your emotions. So if you want to speak confidently, it really is about solving for the emotion of insecurity, when you want to then execute the action of speaking confidently. And this is nothing new that I have not covered in past podcast episodes. But what I really wanted to tie it to is this idea of how as adults, we action swap. And we also are taught this when we're trying to use redirection. And redirection is probably a newer term, and I think it's actually been going on for a while. We've just kind of coined the term when it comes to raising children. So when we look in adulthood at action swapping, it's solving for something that we don't want to be doing by substituting it with another behavior. And if this doesn't work, we often go to something else. So the dieting is a great example, yelling, saying, take care of yourself, practice self-care, and then that'll solve the yelling. People that want to stop smoking often turn to vaping, and then that becomes a problem. Often people who are trying to stop over drinking will turn to eating more food, or maybe even start smoking or vaping. And even trying to not over social media, that'll turn into maybe doing busy work or finding some other sort of outlet. And we think we've kind of alleviated it, and really we've just substituted one action for another, and we're still left with the same result, which is we're not taking the actions we want, we're not getting the results that we want in our life. And the results can be anything. It can be the amount of money we're making, it can be the amount of connection we're having with our loved ones, it can be our health. We're not getting those results that we want because we're so busy substituting one action for another. And the root cause really for behavioral problems, as I said before, is emotions. And the example is yelling comes from anger. So if you don't solve for the anger, you'll continue to yell. You can alleviate some of that yelling by practicing self-care, but that new behavior won't take root and stay and be consistent when we're still having anger, when we're still having issues dealing with our anger, not feeling that emotion, not processing that emotion. When we can solve for that root cause, why we're angry, we will solve yelling. And the same is true with anything we overdo that we don't want to be overdoing. So overeating, when we solve for the emotion that is leading to our overeating, and a lot of times that can be a different set of emotions. Usually it's a set of negative emotions that we're trying to avoid. And so then we turn to food and we eat more of it than our body is required. And so we're avoiding those emotions and alleviating it through food. And so that's why when we switch to a different diet, we're never getting at those emotions that were leading to the overeating and those emotions that needed to be processed and worked through and practiced and learned how to deal with those emotions instead of turning to an action to deal with an emotion. Because no action is going to solve for an emotional problem. If there's anything out of this episode is action swapping, no action will ever solve for an emotional problem. So I'm just going to recap those 2 points before I get into redirecting children. So we action swap in adulthood. So we switch between diets, or we think some action is going to alleviate another action that we're doing that we want to stop doing. And the way to solve for things that we're doing that we don't want to be doing, or even things that we want to start doing, is by looking at the root cause. What are the emotions that are leading to the action we want to stop doing? And what are the emotions that we want to create in our life to start doing the behaviors that we want to do consistently? Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to be talking about is redirection, which is the same as action swapping. And redirection is teaching our children an alternative to a behavior by removing hard feelings. I thought this was kind of interesting, removing hard feelings. And so there are very different examples that I have read. I've read in books, I've read in forums, I've read in articles. And we're often trying to teach, a big chunk of this is often trying to teach kids safety. And when it comes to safety, there is kind of a hard limit. A child is approaching a socket, a plug point where there's electricity, you move them away. The alternative is not really to get them, and depending on their age, to get them to understand that they should be away from the socket. And I'll tell you why, because children up until a certain age cannot be really responsible for their own physical safety. And this is usually up until 12 years old. They are not really responsible. They don't really understand physical safety until up till 12 years old. Now, it could happen earlier. It is very difficult for children to really understand this concept. So I'm not talking about redirection. That is just a safety hard limit for me. That is my opinion. That is a hard limit. You just take them out of safety. But there's these other batch of behaviors that we are trying to redirect. And those behaviors usually involve hitting, biting, kicking, throwing, screaming. And this is very physical types of behaviors in younger children. In older children, it tends to look like, it can also look like hitting other people, yelling, as opposed to screaming. Yelling is using your words at a higher decimal. Name calling, which we often describe that as not showing respect to elders. So what we're trying to do when we're looking at younger children in that hitting, biting, kicking, throwing, screaming category is we're trying to redirect that behavior to something else. We're trying to show them that there's an alternative behavior to hitting, that we should maybe try to touch it gently, and that is action swapping. Notice that hitting and touching something softly, that's one action for another, and you're never dealing with the emotions of what is causing that hitting, what is causing that biting, what is causing that kicking. And the reason why these behaviors are very difficult for us to handle as an adult is because we have certain beliefs that these behaviors will continue when they're older, and that we want to stop them right now, and that this behavior is wrong. And I'm here to tell you that those behaviors are because they're having an emotional experience. They do not have control over their actions, their body actions, because the emotion is happening in their body. So they're hitting because of an emotional experience. They're not hitting necessarily for the same reasons. Yes, older people are hitting for emotional experience, but they have full control over their muscles and how to use them. So when we redirect, we're action swapping, and we never look at the emotions. We're so busy trying to manage the behaviors that we're not ever dealing with the emotion. And it comes back to the same question, is why is my kid hitting? Why is my kid biting? Why is my kid kicking? As an adult, why am I overeating on chocolate? It's because I'm trying to avoid an emotion. Your kid is not avoiding an emotion. Your kid is experiencing an emotion. And then that question becomes are we trying to manage the behavior of hitting? Or are we trying to help manage that emotion? Because when you look at action swapping and redirecting, you're substituting one behavior for another. And then when we get into adulthood, we're still kind of facing these same emotional problems. We're like, how do I handle these problems? And it's because we haven't gotten to the root cause of it, and that is dealing with the emotion. I'm going to be doing a follow-up episode to this, so follow the podcast so you can get the next episode, and I'm going to be focusing more on how to handle hitting and what to do about it with children. That's all I have for you this week. I'll check back with you next.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.